Hi everyone. This is my paper, which I'm going to read, called "We've Always Had a Replicability Crisis." The open science movement and the pre-registration revolution, as they are called, postulate that there is a growing methodological crisis among studies published across various disciplines, suggesting too much of it is unreliable because of the publication bias towards new, surprising results that has led to data manipulation and fraud. Some of these questionable social scientific studies have been difficult or impossible to replicate or reproduce, leading to calls for reform. Hence the call to pre-register your research, meaning you specify your research plan in advance of your study and submit it to a registry. As Psychological Science laid it out in 2015, researchers would, quote, submit their research rationale, hypotheses, design, and analytic strategy to the journal for peer review before beginning the study. This submission can undergo rejection and revision just as in the typical journal review process. If accepted at this stage, then researchers can begin their study knowing that it has been approved in principle. The article continues, quote, because researchers are forced to formulate a proposal for a new study without seeing results first, there is an expectation that they will do a better job of addressing research motivation and design. The result should be better studies that respond clearly to precisely formulated questions. So I want to make 2 points. First, for those of us who use qualitative methods in media studies, historical, ethnographic, in-depth interviews, or even more suspect, textual and semiotic analysis, we have constantly had our work questioned along these very lines. The charges include whether our work is verifiable, generalizable, reliable, reproducible, and of course predictive. Thus, to suggest that qualitative research be subjected to such a protocol only further institutionalizes and marginalizes methodological biases. Second, and more importantly, pre-registration not only does not map onto how qualitative scholars do their research, but it is also in direct violation of it. As Wikipedia puts it, the goal is to, quote, encourage publication of studies with rigorous methods, creating a time-stamped, non-modifiable public record of the study and analysis plan before the data is collected, end quote. To a qualitative researcher, having a non-modifiable research plan sounds crazy, and it is crazy. Let me cite 2 examples, historical research and textual analysis. In both cases, we do not start with hypotheses or some cast-in-stone set of sources. In both cases, we may not fully know what or where our sources will be. Historians especially have to be detectives, locating archives, interview subjects, primary sources, and even artifacts. One place leads you to another, and one research question leads you to another. We know roughly what our methods will be in using such sources, but we often do not know yet what our analytical, explanatory, or theoretical frameworks will be because indeed we haven't yet seen the data. Typically, our first question is what happened, often followed by when, as in what were the representations of women in the media in the 1960s, or what happened to the television industry in the late 20th century. The next questions are usually how and why. For example, how and why did right-wing talk radio become such a powerful force in the U.S. beginning in the late 1980s? The how often leads to the why, and the why can lead to broader theoretical explanations, such as, in this case, the interaction between perceived threats to masculinity in the wake of the women's movement, a changing regulatory environment favoring media consolidation, abandonment of the fairness doctrine, the rise of well-financed neoconservative movements, and the discursive success and conquest, really, of neoliberalism. None of these causes and how they intersected could be known in some time-stamped document. With textual analysis, you may have some suspicions, even predictions, of what you think you will find about, say, race or gender or sexuality, but you can't know for sure until you analyze the texts themselves. For example, when I started working on Where the Girls Are and the representation of women in the 1950s and 60s, a time I grew up with, my prediction was that I would find an unadulterated outpouring of sexist fare. And while, of course, I did find that, an analysis of the major, most popular, and widely circulated texts of the time, especially when placed within the changing political, cultural, and social context of the times, revealed something I wasn't expecting: an incipient pre-feminism in the media, albeit metaphorically represented, in the early and mid-1960s. This is what qualitative researchers excel at, identifying the contradictions, the fissures in media texts, how they embody prevailing cultural hopes and anxieties, and the ideological work that they do. You simply cannot know this ahead of time. So, to take on the suspicions about textual analysis, of course, there have been irresponsible textual analyses, and I maintain that it is indeed dangerous and historically irresponsible to do a reading of one media text in isolation and think you have much to say, either about the text or its time or its significance. Buffy, for example, became an industry unto its own of textual analysis run amok. But research documents, however, that not surprisingly, if multiple media texts from the same or different media outlets represent certain kinds of narratives, heroes, and villains repeatedly, and favor and even magnify certain media frames over and over, it is likely that there is some correspondence between these media representations and many people's attitudes and beliefs. This is especially true when the issue or the person or the country being represented is remote to us and the media outlets are prestigious. Work on thinnest ideals in the media and young girls' self-esteem and body image, on racial stereotypes in the media and racial attitudes, on coverage of politicians and their poll ratings, among others, affirm that the dominant preferred meanings of multiple overlapping media texts are often the same meanings many audience members assume as well. And while cultivation analysis, made famous by George Gerbner, has indeed taken its licks over the years, especially for the possibility of confounding correlations with causality, the findings about certain dominant discourses in the world of TV and heavy viewers' worldviews corresponding to the ideologies of those discourses remains persuasive. All I have to say is Fox News. In this view of the media as reinforcer of ideology, and here we get to Gramsci's theoretical framework, it is the ongoing iteration and intertextuality of such meanings which draw from and magnify certain socially held worldviews over others that find widespread purchase because they do come to seem like the common sense of a culture. It is the job of media historians to identify what the common sense was in past media environments, what the dominant sensibilities were, as well as which coexisting discourses challenged that common sense. In arguing for the legitimacy of textual analysis, such work must pay attention to the broader historical, political, and economic context within which such texts were produced and received, and how the media landscape was changing during the period under study. Some images, metaphors, and narratives are repeated within and across texts, and without such findings, repetition, making certain claims about preferred meanings, are very difficult. We must be skeptical of all texts and whose views and responses are included and whose are not. But it is context, repetition, intertextuality, contradiction, skepticism, and empathy that must shape and guide this work, and together make it persuasive. Media history has confounded less suspicion, presumably because of the legitimacy of archives, but we historians often find that archives are top-down, produced by governments or corporations, and thus are incomplete. We can't know what we'll find until we get there, what research questions they'll evoke or reframe, and how we'll fill in the gaps, which for me has, over the years, required building my own archives of interviews, press accounts, radio and television shows, and the like. I could not have predicted what I was going to find, what I was going to need to create with a time-stamped, non-modifiable public record of the study and analysis plan before the data is collected. In conclusion, and simply put, you can't have the pre-registration of qualitative research. Indeed, this strikes me as paternalistic, methodological gatekeeping, a violation of decades-old research methods, and even censorship. Thank you.